Hello Year 10. So last week we looked over Elizabeth's coronation and her early life. This week we are going to zoom in on the ways in which she boosted and maintained her popularity throughout her reign from her coronation through to her death in 1603. So if you have your exercise book, what I would like you to do is write down the title, which is Elizabethan England, Elizabeth's popularity. And our learning objective for this week is to be able to give really detailed explanations of the ways in which Elizabeth maintained her popularity. To get started this week, though, we are going to have a go at the 4-mark question that you already attempted last week. So here's our question. Using the two sources, what can you learn about the personality of Elizabeth I? Now, if we cast our minds back to last week, remember that this question is really, really simple, but people overcomplicate it. So what we're going to look out for is 2 aspects of source A that we can talk about and then explain what they tell us about Elizabeth I, and then 2 sections of source B, which is the portrait. So source A then, a description of Elizabeth by the Spanish ambassador to England in 1558. He said, "She is now about 25 years old. Her figure and face are very handsome," which is a Tudor word for beautiful, "and such an air of majesty pervades, so surrounds all her actions, that no one can fail to suppose that she is a true queen. She seems greatly more feared than her sister, and gives her orders in a way that is as absolute as her father would have." And then if we look at source B, this is the magnificent portrait of her as a princess at the age of 13. So behind her on by the bed lays the Old Testament, and in her hand she's holding the New Testament. She had this portrait painted for Edward VI, so her brother, as like her he was an educated and dedicated Protestant. She would have been able to read these texts, so the Old Testament and the New Testament, in English or in Latin and Greek. So, have a go at answering this question. Remember, 2 sentences of what we can learn from source A, including quotes, and 2 aspects of source B. I've given you some hints. So I might look out for the evidence that she's pious, so very religious, that she's well educated. From source A, I might look at the idea that she was quite strong in her personality and that she was royal in her demeanour, or that she was a born leader. So put a pause on the video and have a go at this in your book now. This week I'm going to want you to email me a picture of that particular question so that I can mark it. So having had a go at that 4-mark question, we're now going to zoom in and look at the 3 P's of Elizabeth's popularity. So the 3 P words that tell us everything we need to know about how she maintained her popularity. And there were 3 methods she used. So the first was the use of her personality. The second was her use of portraiture, and the third was her use of progresses. Now, portraits, we know what portraiture means. That's pictures of her. Personality, herself, her education, the way that she spoke to people, the way she presented herself. Progresses is a new word. Progresses were journeys that a king or queen in the medieval and early modern periods would go on away from London, where they lived for most of the year, for between 6 to 10 weeks a year. And the whole idea of this was that she was getting out amongst her people. So we're going to investigate these 3 aspects in more detail in this lesson. So you have a choice now. You can either write the 3 P's of popularity as a subtitle, and then underneath write personality, leave 4 lines, portraiture, leave 4 lines, progresses, leave 4 lines. Or, like I've done here, you can complete this as a mind map. You're now going to need to open up the online textbook, which is in the Google Drive that I've set up for you. And you're going to need to pause this video in a second. So you're going to have to open up chapter 1 and open it to pages 8 and 9. And there you can read information about how Elizabeth used her personality and how Elizabeth used progresses. So put a pause on this, read that information, and then jot down evidence on those 2 areas, personality and progresses, for me. Okay, so that should have taken you about 10 minutes, and you should have gotten down a fair bit of detail about personality and progresses. Now, remember, the aim of the game here is detail. So if you haven't gotten down some of these ideas, I want you to add them in green pen underneath your own notes. So firstly, under personality, it's really important to note that Elizabeth had had a humanist education. This meant that she could speak Latin, Greek, French, Spanish, and Italian. The humanists believed that in the study of ancient history, so in the study of how the Roman and the Greek world worked, humanity could be improved. She was trained in the subject of rhetoric. This means a little bit like a lawyer is trained today. She knew how to speak really persuasively and win debates. Now, this was really special because this was a subject that was taught to boys, it was taught to men. But because Elizabeth had such a good education, she was actually allowed to study what was quite a masculine subject. Alongside her intelligence and her education, she was also an expert horsewoman and huntress and a dancer as well. She knew all the trendy dances of Europe. She was also known to be very charming when she needed to be, but she was also extremely strong-willed and stubborn and quick to anger. Many a servant who upset her ended up with a slipper to the head, for example, or even worse, being expelled from court and not allowed to come back. Finally, Elizabeth referred to herself as the Lions Club, so she played up the similarity, Lions Club I should have said, so she played up the similarity she shared with her father. With regards to progresses, you should have written down that these were journeys in the summer away from her palaces in the south, that she would travel through towns and villages, and this allowed her to see and be seen by her people. And as a consequence of her journeys in the summer, she truly believed that she knew thousands of her subjects by name just from travelling through sort of the towns that they lived in. As part of her progresses, she would stay in the homes of her nobles, and this was seen as a great privilege and might result in something called patronage. So if she stayed with you and you really, really impressed her, she might give you a new title or new lands or a new job. It also, Elizabeth being massively intelligent and very pragmatic, helped her to keep an eye on her nobles. If there were any she didn't particularly trust or she thought might propose a rebellion against her, she could go and stay in their house during the summer for a bit too long and basically bankrupt them because it was so expensive to look after her. So we've looked at progresses and we've looked at her personality. What we're now going to do is look at her portraits. Now, portraits were massively important to Elizabeth I. She lived in an era where people were massively visually literate. That meant that even if they couldn't read or write, they would be able to look at images of her and be able to read the depth of symbolism in her paintings. For example, a really big aspect of lots of her portraits are the use of fine fabrics, but also the use of pearls. Now, pearls were massively expensive. They were actually brought up from the bottom of the ocean by expert free divers in West Africa. But even more importantly than that, in the early modern period, in Elizabethan England and Tudor England as well, they represented chastity and virginity. So where you see Elizabeth covered in pearls, she's really highlighting to her audience that she is the Virgin Queen. So what I want you to do is look in detail at two particular portraits, the Armada portrait and the Rainbow portrait. In your book, write a subtitle of these two portraits' names and their dates, and using the internet, can you find out what the hidden symbols are within those portraits? Okay, let's look in detail at the Rainbow portrait. I've chosen this one and not the Armada because this is my absolute favourite portrait of Elizabeth I. The main reason it's my favourite portrait is because this was actually created when she was around the age of 70, but yet she looks beautifully youthful. She looks young. She looks like she's somewhere between the ages of sort of 20 and 30. And the reason why she's decided to do this is because at this stage in her reign, she hasn't actually got a successor. She hasn't got somebody to come after her. So she's trying to make herself look as young as possible so rumours don't spread about the possible future death of the Queen and nobody will try and overthrow her. I also love this portrait because it is so full of secret meanings and symbols. So firstly, like I've already said, she's absolutely covered in pearls. She's got pearls around her neck, she's got pearls in her hair, she's got a pearl at her forehead. Now this was the symbol of virginity and chastity, so it's the symbol that she's decided not to get married, which is what she's famous for. She's famous in history as the Virgin Queen. On her head is a cornucopia. Now, if you've been to a harvest festival at school, you might have seen these before. She's basically symbolising that her reign has been one of plenty. Now, this is really ironic because when this portrait was painted, England was actually going through a prolonged period of hunger, of disastrous harvest that had led to starvation. So she's kind of getting across this propaganda idea that Elizabethan England is really plentiful, and actually lots of people were starving. We'll look at the poor laws which she created later on in this course. We also see across her shoulder, if you look really carefully, in that orange silk that she has over her shoulder and wrapped around her waist, you can very carefully, if you look, see eyes, ears and lips. This is a symbol that she has the support of her people. Now, by this time, she'd suffered a lot of plots to overthrow her and assassination attempts. She also had a massive army of spies. So what she is saying is she's got intelligence, she's got the knowledge and the support of her people to know and be able to stop any plots against her. On her arm is also a symbol of a snake. Now, the snake, if we think about the story of Adam and Eve, is a symbol of temptation. But when Eve bit the apple, she gained knowledge. So snakes in the Tudor period were also a symbol of wisdom and knowledge. So she's wearing that on her sleeve to show that she is a wise and knowledgeable ruler. Lastly, we also have in her hand, though it doesn't really look like a rainbow, colours fade in portraits over time, she's holding the rainbow. So she is saying that she is the bringer of peace to England. And in Latin, non sine sole iris, there's no rainbow without the sun. So she's saying she is like the sun. She's the sun to England. She's life-giving. So many symbols in this portrait. A little bit big-headed if we look at it from a modern perspective. But in her time, really, really important. Because in this period of Elizabethan England, she was facing lots of issues. So this is very much a propaganda image. Okay, well done for taking part in this week's lesson. In the email, I've put some extra tasks that I want you to do revolving around Elizabethan progresses. But for now, once you've done that, I want you to remember to send evidence of the work that you've completed this week to your teacher and make sure that you stay safe.